look, I'm a bit shocked when I'm introduced as having 30 years experience, and I think, well, you know, that's a long time, but I feel that I've been, in some respects, saying the same thing for 30 years. And you know, once again, I think I'm going to repeat it here. So I'm a trade economist, and some of these trade issues have been with us time and time again. And it is, of course, food security has been an issue for most of my lifetime. We recall in the early 70s, there was a crisis. In the 80s, there was a crisis. I was at the Food and Agricultural Organization in June 1996, where we had the World Food Summit, because there was another crisis. In 2008, there was a crisis. I guess in a couple of years there'll be more crises, perhaps. And I want to perhaps give you a perspective of where things are going. And now there's certainly an issue, because there are several international organizations, IMF, OECD, FAO, IFPRI, that have said commodity prices have gone down for 300 years, but from now on, they're going to go up. Instead of agriculture being a supply side problem, instead of being a demand side problem, where we've had too much supply and policy's been focused on limiting supply, then maybe the opposite has occurred. We won't have enough food. And I want to have a look at that. I'm going to make some recommendations about policy. What the Indonesians are doing. Maybe what the Vietnamese are doing. And I'll mention a bit about Thailand. And we'll say, well, maybe things could be done better. Indonesia has a new food law, and I'm going to say they're misguided. There are some good things, of course, but other things could be done better. Okay, so here's my outline for the talk. Rising concerns about prices moving around much more than they did, price volatility. What should we do about that? I'm going to talk about some core policies that we see at the moment. Things could be done better. We'll have a look at some price trends. What's driving these trends? The demand factors. Population, income, biofuels. On the supply side, we're running out of land, productivity, some of these issues. And of course, I've spent a lot of my time doing some trade modelling, so I want to show some of the things I did last weekend. It's useful to have some tools to illustrate some of these issues. And I'll conclude after 40 minutes with some policy recommendations. Okay, so what are people concerned about? And we see here, exporters are putting on restrictions on some of their exports. That's something we haven't seen in the past. It moves, for example, in Indonesia here towards self-sufficiency. We're not that happy with that. Well, we can understand why this is attractive. It's certainly politically attractive, but we see this in Vietnam and China and many other countries. Global stocks, maybe 8% of consumption, so people are concerned that they're getting too low. People are concerned about expanding population, rising incomes. This is also interesting, declining research and development in agriculture. That's something we could address, I think. What about climate change? More floods and droughts? Have we seen those, or is it difficult to tell? We should give perhaps some attention to that. Loss of land to urban development. What about the speculation? Is the price instability driven by speculation? Some people are concerned about that. And this one here, biofuel demand. Have we seen the worst of that? Okay, so there are many reasons to be concerned that things perhaps weren't as they are. what can governments do? Well, one option, maybe this is quite a good idea, do nothing. Like doctors, the first objective of government is do no harm. Okay, so this is an economist speaking here. And of course the lawyers amongst us, well, I like to tell this little joke. What's the difference between lawyers and economists? The lawyers want to regulate everything, and economists want to deregulate. Obviously there is a role for government, but the government has to do good, not bad, and it is possible to make things worse. Okay, so self-sufficiency is one policy we can follow. We can open the economy up to trade, and I'll be recommending that as a good policy. We can build up public stocks. We can pay money to store more food publicly. Or we can encourage private stocks. The Indonesian government does both of these things. Or we can have a regional stockholding arrangement within ASEAN or within ASEAN plus 3. And this has been talked about for 20 years. But there are problems with getting that to cooperate. And the Indonesian government does do a bit of work on increasing productivity. And of course, you know, the problem with food security, there is enough food, but it's the wrong sort of food in the wrong places. And the people who are not connected with the market, they're in remote areas, they're the ones who tend to be excited. The Indonesian government has done work on social safety nets. Perhaps there's more to be done there. And as I said, the other alternative, in some areas you do nothing. So that's what can be done. Well, in fact, what is being done? The 2012 food law focused on self-sufficiency. Not only on rice, but on dairy products and beef and many other crops and so on. Now, I think this is a mistake. You can see politically why this has happened. What drives the government to push these policies. But in fact, as I said a moment ago, there is enough food, but it's the wrong sort of food. So there's still chronic, according to FAO, chronic hunger in Indonesia amongst 8% of the population. That's something we could do something about. And children under 5, many of them are not tall enough for their age. So this is called stunting, if you like, due to undernutrition. And not so much they don't get the right enough calories, but they don't get the micronutrients because the food, their diet is not diverse enough. There's too much rice and not enough fruit and vegetables and other products that provide the necessary range of vitamins like A, B, C, D, folic acid, things like that. So it's a bit strange to be hearing an economist, a trade economist particularly, talking about micronutrients. But that's part of the issue. And later on in the discussion, Ronnie's going to talk a bit more about some of the details about where the poor are, how they're affected, and connecting the markets up through the value chain to get a better result for some of these people. Now, Vietnam, I go there a lot. If anything, they also have bad policies. Their policy is to set aside 3.8 million hectares that's only for rice production. Once again, their problem is even worse for here. Their diet is not diverse enough, and they haven't grown enough of the other crops that would be better for many of their population. And they also have a range of schemes that interfere with the market, probably doing more harm than good. And Thailand is very interesting. The Thai government in 2011 had an interesting idea. Their idea was, well, firstly we'll pay producers 50% more than the market price, and then we'll buy up all the stocks. The world price, Thailand is the major exporter of rice. The world price will rise, and then we'll sell off all the stocks and make a profit. We'll make a speculative gain. And in the meantime, we'll buy the votes of many people in the north of Thailand, and Prime Minister Shinawatra will get elected and do very well. Well, that went well until 2014 when she was thrown out in a military coup, and the farmers weren't paid what they had been promised. And Thailand is now sitting on 3 or 4 years of consumption's worth, 17 million tonnes of rice that's slowly going, well, spoilage I think is the word, slowly going rotten. And they have to dump that onto the world market, depressing prices. So I'm not sure who thought up this policy in the Ministry of Agriculture in Thailand. Well, obviously it was politically driven. And one thing I might say about that, perhaps it did lead to the Thai government, to a democratically elected government being thrown out. And of course now the political situation is worse than it ever was because of, obviously this is bad policy. And you can see how bad policy has important ramifications. So Vietnam and Thailand, they haven't done it better than what we're doing here. Okay, so here's the cause of concern in 2008. I remember being in Geneva at the time when the rice price reached, for 1 week it reached $1,100 a tonne. It's now around $380, $400. So people were getting very concerned at this time. The price of oil was then $147 a tonne. And people were predicting oil would go to 200 and stay there for 10 years. Well, oil's now $50 or $60 a barrel. And of course, obviously there's talk about, well, where will it go next? This is a perspective. Now, so I don't really like to boast that I have the longest time series, but here's a time series from 1650, 350 years, to 2005. Now, commodity prices have fallen. Okay, there are some issues about how you measure commodity prices 300 years ago. Now we have commodities, soybeans, we didn't have then. And obviously there are measurement issues and so on. But the general trend is prices have gone down for 300 years. And now IMF, OECD, FAO is saying, well, no, this time it's different. From now on, they'll go up. That's certainly what they were saying in 2013. But what I'm saying to you, well, is it really different? We're not sure whether the current shocks that we've seen in 2008 and 2011, are they temporary? Is it something like this? Typically what's happened here is during a war, and there's 100 years war in Europe back in the 18th century. Prices tend to go up in those times, and during a depression, prices tend to fall. So there are drivers of these factors, but the overall trend is down. Let's have a look at 2008. See if we can explain what happened there. Okay, here's some of the factors that we'd like to talk about. What drove 2008? Inventory levels were low. Stocks were low. Corn, particularly, and palm oil is being used to make fuel, biofuel, ethanol, sugar, etc. Was that an issue? Oil prices are driving fuel and fertilizer prices. So that raises the cost of agricultural production. we can see substitution effects. There's a greater demand for corn, prices of wheat and other products also go up. They're substituting. And my favourite, various export restrictions, particularly with rice. And this one here, panic. I talked yesterday to an audience at the Ministry of Trade, and someone said to me, well, what about speculation? Didn't that drive the price up? And there's been a lot of talk about that. And one of the institutions that I work for from time to time, UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, this is their favourite explanation, that a lot of the shocks on commodity prices are driven by speculation. They haven't convinced me, so I find at UNCTAD, I don't have many people to talk to. Okay, so what did the IMF do? So these are different commodities here: rice, corn or maize, wheat, palm oil, that's Indonesia, and sort of rapeseed oil, soybean oil. Now, two things to focus on here for Indonesia. One is what happened to rice, and we can see the blue box refers to fuel and fertilizer prices driving up the price of the commodity. So this is the blue box here. The green box refers to export restrictions driving up world prices. And the IMF says that's the most important in the case of rice, which is a thin market. And the top one is, the yellow box is substitution effects. The price of rice goes up because there's a shortage of other factors. Now, for corn, maize, sometimes we call it, the demand for biofuels caused a big increase in prices of corn, and some of that led to substitution effects, raising up prices of other commodities. Palm oil, apparently this is a very contentious issue in Indonesia, and I thought palm oil was used to make soap and cooking oil and so on, but much of it is used for biofuels to produce ethanol in the European Union. And the European Union has a problem with unsustainable management of palm oil plantations here. And so we can see what might happen. So that was one of the factors that are driving the price of corn, and there are substitution effects. And we see this big, the substitution effects driving up the price of palm oil on the global market. So the conclusion here really is, in terms of rice, trade and export restrictions, countries did panic. And if we have a look at OECD data for Indonesia, domestic producers were forced to sell at prices here that were well below world prices. And Ronnie has a chart that shows in one of his documents that world prices went up in 2008 greatly, but the domestic price was rather flat. And in other years it's reversed, and we see in the OECD data now that Indonesian farmers are receiving a price that's much higher than the world price. And of course Thailand is driving the price down because they have these surplus stocks. But Indonesia has effectively smoothed out those world fluctuations. Okay, let's talk about what sort of drives these factors in the long run. On the demand side, we can see there, is population growth an issue? What about rising incomes? There's demand for biofuels, etc. Has productivity slowed down? Is that going to be an issue in the future? Are we running out of land and fertiliser and So, now here's an interesting chart provided by some people in the GTAP community. That's a GTAP performs general equilibrium modelling, which I tend to do. And in fact, the community provides a commonly used database that's used for this sort of analysis. And these guys have put together a history of what's driven prices in the last 50 years, from 61 to 2006. And here they list three things. There's what drives prices down is farm productivity. So here's zero here, and prices are driven down by increases in farm productivity. This has been happening for 350 years. We get increases in supply because of better technology and so on. That causes prices to go down. On the other side, there's increasing population and increasing incomes. And so in the last 50 years, the contribution, I think we have, you have to see these colours. Okay, so I think this is the population, the second bar here. So that's growth in population has made a big contribution to rising prices in the last 50 years. And then there's growth in per capita income. What happens when people get richer? Well, of course, the biggest effect is China. They demand more protein diets. And this means we need more feed to produce cattle and, well, maybe not sheep, but pork and poultry, for example. So we see a lot of feed coming into these, being imported into these countries. You know, Indonesia imports soya beans and high protein foods. And that raises the demand for some of these crops. Okay, so that's the last 50 years. What do we think is going to happen as we go further forward? What we see here is population has a decreasing role. It so happens, it's also true, as countries get richer, people live longer, but fertility drops. The number of children that each woman has tends to fall. Now I tell a story, 60 years ago. I'm the youngest of 6 children. And that wasn't uncommon in those days. But it turns out I have none myself. So I'm contributing to zero population growth. And it's quite unusual now in many rich countries for parents to have 3 children. Many only have 2. And we can see these trends across many countries. As income increases, people have less children. And the UNDP, who estimates population, they have overestimated population growth for 50 years. And every 3 years they come out with a report saying, well, we said fertility was going to be this, but it turns out it's dropped in all these countries. So fertility is probably dropping faster than we have previously projected. The result is population growth is not going to drive prices in the demand for food in the future. But income growth will be more important. And we can see, this sort of brown box here, that becomes more important, has a bigger impact in the future. As more and more countries like Indonesia, China, India, and then at a lower level, Vietnam, they move in, they have a larger and larger middle class, which is demanding a protein diet. Okay, what about biofuels? My opinion is biofuels were a mistake. And now that's starting to be realised in the US and the European Union. they're starting to wind back their mandates on biofuels. So they have rules that 10% of fuel has to come from ethanol, produced from corn or sugar and so on. Once you have policies like that, it's difficult to reverse them. But we've probably seen the worst of that, and the influence of demand for biofuels will probably decrease in the future. So we think that impact going forward is probably relatively slight compared to the other factors. Obviously the key thing is productivity growth in agriculture. What drives this? There are 4 factors. Well, you can expand area. After a while, you run out of land, but you can see from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, there's an increase in production because we've managed to increase area in various places. If you fly around the world, you'll see, well, most of the land underneath you is vacant, underutilised. Well, typically I fly across Australia and most of it is desert. And also there's a lack of water. So irrigation has made a contribution. We can see that's probably declining. There's still some scope there. And the green box is other inputs such as land and fertiliser and fuel. To get more output, just encourage more inputs and so on. The main factor though, in the last 10 years, is called total factor productivity. And this means we do things smarter. For example, there are better varieties of crops. There are better ways of organising land. We could probably increase production. I think Ronnie may have some data on this. The gap between potential yields and actual yields, it's maybe 30 or 40%. And there's probably lots of scope for doing things better. And that's where we think we can, most of the growth will come from. Doing things in a smarter way, total factor productivity. For that we need research and development. Let's look at what's happened for productivity over the last few years. And I don't have Indonesia separately, but here's Southeast Asia. And we can see in the last 10 years, productivity growth has actually been quite good. You can't see this figure here, it's 3.3, but it compares quite well with previous decades. So in fact, productivity has increased in Southeast Asia. And of course, we can also look at the developing countries as a whole, 2.2. Developed countries, also 2%. And Africa is an interesting case. So here's North Africa, 3% growth. Sub-Saharan Africa, that's the problem. There's nothing growing there. So everything south of the Sahara Desert. There's some rich land in Zimbabwe and South Africa itself and Zambia and so on. Botswana, produce a lot of cattle. There, they haven't been that productive. 0.5, so growth is low. So they could probably do much better in some of those regions, which is where population growth is high. Okay, so we have done quite well, in spite of talk about lack of research and development going into agricultural productivity. What's the conclusion from these guys? The GTAP people here, they say, well, in 2050, corn prices, which have moved a great deal, they'll probably go down. Contrary to what IMF, OECD, FAO were saying in 2013. What's my conclusion to this point? Well, we should do something about the biofuels mandate. We should remove that. the countries like Indonesia should support WTO movements to remove restrictions on imports. Currently, that's not the case. There are restrictions on subsidies. You cannot subsidize exports under the WTO regulations, but you can actually put restrictions on exports. And this, in fact, leads to a problem. And WTO members could do something about that. So far, they're reluctant to do that. It is discussed quite a bit, but there are several major countries, like Argentina, for example, who uses export taxes. They don't want to move on. And of course, we should continue to increase agricultural, do things to increase agricultural productivity. Probably we can do more there. Let's have a look at Indonesia specifically. Indonesia could rely on trade for rice in particular. It doesn't need to produce all its own rice. And the question here is, well, how stable is production in Indonesia? And when we have a problem here, when there's a fall in supply, what's happening in the neighbouring countries? Do they move together? If there's a lack of supply in Indonesia, is there also a lack of supply in Vietnam and Thailand? And maybe China. If there's a weather event, does it affect all countries in the region in the same way? Well, the answer is no. Here's Indonesia's rice production, and it's actually grown fairly consistently since 1961. 50 years of data, and there's pretty much a steady upward trend. Here's a little line that goes through there. Fitting the trend can be a little bit difficult, but here this one's quite good. And the deviations around that trend, well, they're actually quite small, but I want to compare these with our neighbouring countries. Okay, so we trade with Thailand and Vietnam. And if you look closely at this at a later date, you'll see when Indonesian production is above trend, it tends to be below trend in those other two countries. They're not correlated. We don't have an El Nino event that causes falls in crop production in these three countries. So these lines do not move together. Here's Indonesia and China. China is obviously important because it's so big, and China also has a self-sufficiency policy. It does trade a little bit, but not so much. But fluctuations in China obviously important for the global market. So here's the correlation between Indonesia, and we can see it's a little bit the same. It moves the same as China, which is important, but it moves different from Vietnam and Thailand. So the point here is, instead of Indonesia building up its own stocks, which seems to be the policy, it can trade with these other countries. Occasionally there may be a global shock to prices, and then it has to import at when prices are very high. But that's driven by export restrictions and people panicking in the market. So what I'm saying is, Indonesia does not have to follow a self-sufficiency policy, and does not have to carry a large volume of stocks. I had a look at 4 policies. I'm going to show you the impact of these policies just to illustrate what we're doing wrong here. So these are the 4 policies. We could remove barriers to trade, effectively remove tariffs and non-tariff barriers. There's a self-sufficiency policy. Indonesia has a policy for increasing rice production 200 kilograms a year. If it could increase it by 5%, what would happen there? Would that make a big difference? That's probably achievable. Or we could have a domestic stockpile. So I'm going to put some numbers on these policies. So what was rice production in 2012? So they're the figures. This is from the OECD estimates, the policy and estimates of producer subsidy equivalent. And we can see the figure here. So market price support amounted to 140 trillion. The value of production was 305. OECD reports the producer support estimate was 34%. Farmers are getting 34% than the world market price, according to the OECD. And in 2008, it was a negative number, but in 2012, this is what they were doing. Self-sufficiency was pretty good. And the government says, well, we have to get, I think in the food bill, they talk about 90%. But the data I have from the GTAP people says, in 2011, it was 96%. But what's the cost to achieve this level of sufficiency? Okay, so what we do is, of course, the 140 trillion is just a transfer from one group to another. And we don't care about transfers. We care about resources being used inefficiently. We want to estimate that number. How inefficient are they? Could we produce more by rearranging production so we produce more fruit and vegetables and maize and other crops rather than producing rice? Okay, so here are the results here. We remove the support to producers, and we estimate, using the GTAP data, output of rice would fall 7%. We would have to import more, of course. We would have to double the imports, but imports are fairly low at the moment. And the self-sufficiency ratio would fall from 96% to 93%. So I guess if you were in Singapore, you would think that 93% was still a pretty good deal. We can't produce everything ourselves. And we have an estimated welfare gain. Keep that in mind, I'll come back to that. We compare it with other solutions. Now, what's happening here is we reduce the output of rice to 7%. And we can use the land and the capital and the labour to do something else, to produce other goods. And here we see what we could produce. There are other cereals, oil seeds, oils, sugar, what we call other crops, livestock, beef, poultry, etc., dairy products, processed foods, beverages and tobacco. And we can see what's happened. The green bars refer to Indonesia, but Indonesia can produce a lot of other commodities, and this will diversify the diet, which will be good for undernourishment, malnutrition, improved vitamin A, and so on. But what happens in Vietnam is exactly the opposite. They'll start exporting to Indonesia, the 3%, 120% increase in exports. It comes from Vietnam and Thailand. But Vietnam has to transfer resources out of these other crops to produce more rice if it's going to supply the export market. Well, is that good or not? We'd like to know the impacts of these things. Okay, I think I have 5 minutes to talk about a few other things. Here's an estimate. Indonesian policy is to store grain. And I worked with a co-author at the Ministry of Trade here in Indonesia. We tried to get estimates. What does it actually cost to hold rice for a year? And the government pays credit subsidy to help people store rice. Well, there are two aspects. There's the physical storage. You need to have a warehouse, somewhere to store the commodity. Some of it gets lost and ruined, a certain percentage. And then there are interest costs. Well, I mean, maybe 7% seems a bit high, depending on where the money's coming from, I suppose. And we also assume here, you can buy the rice, you sell it a year later, maybe you sell it at a profit, maybe you sell it at a loss. People who, government stockholding agencies, they're not that good at predicting where the prices are going to go. And there's a long history of having to sell stocks at a loss. But let's assume that they can sell it. They don't make any losses or gains there. The crop's worth this amount. If they're storing 10%, then we can see, 17% of that cost comes to this fairly large figure here. So we have an estimate of what it costs to store this grain. And my co-author at the Ministry of Trade, well, he wasn't really sure how good these data were. I mean, maybe it was a bit higher than that, or possibly it could be a bit lower, but we do have an order of magnitude. Storing grain instead of trading it is an expensive way of stabilising prices. What if we could get a 5% increase in productivity? Well, obviously the gains are very large, but it's a bit spurious because the productivity gains come from nowhere at no cost in my assumption. But in fact, if these gains could come from nowhere, well, why haven't producers done that? Maybe there are reasons. Maybe we could get some of these gains for nothing, but it usually means more research and development, more extension, more investment by the government. The government has to do things, or the private sector has to do things to get these gains. So although I've said, well, they come from nowhere, there is actually a cost of increasing productivity. What happens here? Well, in fact, we don't get an increase, a change in output. Farmers are more productive, but the market price goes down 10%. Because there's no extra demand for the product. We do get a big change in inputs. And in fact, this is the government policy. Increase productivity, and we'll become self-sufficient. And that's a good policy if it can work. So self-sufficiency by increasing productivity is good. By putting up a trade barrier, that's not good. Trying to store the commodity is not good. So we see here the change in the market price. And this is a benefit to consumers, to people who are undernourished or malnourished and so on. The market price of rice goes down under this policy. So that's what we should be doing. Although I've said, well, no cost here. So that's an assumption that we really can't justify. But this is a good policy. Here's the summary. We remove the output subsidies. So we get these efficiency gains of 59 million. Well, that's not so great, but there are large transfers involved. But we do think we'll look at that. The productivity gains gives us a very large number. talk about that. Holding the stocks, quite a large negative number. So the trade option is better than the stock holding option. Okay, let me just make a few policy recommendations before I wind up. More funding, more research and development for agriculture. And since I'm often employed by, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, they send me here to help, encourage increasing productivity in agriculture, then I'm bound to say that this is a good policy. That's a little bit of self-interest there. Could we spend too much on extension and development? Well, of course, we have to know what works. But the government Indonesian government probably agrees with this. See if we can improve actual yields compared to the potential. Again, there's a role for education and extension and development. Remove trade barriers. That's not what's happened here. Better market information. They could probably do better with connecting producers to consumers. Producers to produce what consumers actually want. They could do better with that. I haven't talked about financial instruments to smooth prices. The policy here is stocks to smooth prices. But you could also do it with financial instruments like hedging and so on. What do we conclude? Self-sufficiency and expensive approach to food security. And holding stocks is probably not the best way forward. Here's a reference to some of the charts that I produced. Mr. Chairman, I think this is a timely end to my presentation. Thank you very much.